There are some places in this world that just feel important, places where the air is heavier and the silence means more than any noise. In the heart of an old Canadian city, nestled between modern glass towers and bustling financial district streets, was one of those places, a restaurant called The Vault. On the outside, The Vault looked like any other high-end Italian spot. Dim lights, heavy wooden doors, and the faint, beautiful smell of roasting garlic and fine leather. But everyone who knew anything about this city knew The Vault wasn't just a place to eat. It was the unofficial office, the fortress of Dominic Vergano. Hey there and welcome back. I'm so happy you're here. Grab that blanket, maybe pour yourself a hot drink and get really comfortable because today we're settling in for a story you won't forget. Before we dive any deeper though, let me know how you're doing. Drop a quick comment and tell me what part of the world you're watching from today. And if you want to stay with us through all the twists and turns ahead, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a moment. Alright, let's get back to it. Dominic Vergano was 42, though he looked like the kind of man who had seen 80 years of trouble compressed into 4 decades. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. That's why people feared him. He moved like a shadow, and when he sat like a stone statue carved from granite. He was sitting exactly like that now in a private corner booth, the low light catching the stark silver in his dark hair. He was focused entirely on a stack of financial reports, his jaw set in that permanent calculated line. Across from him sat Jonas Vale, his most trusted man. Jonas was a few years younger, fast-moving and always watching the door. The room was mostly empty, save for a couple of bodyguards near the entrance. All of them quiet, all of them professional, all of them following Dominic's unspoken rule. Silence is respect. The silence was the first thing that broke. It didn't crack. It shattered like cheap glass hitting a marble floor. It started with a choked, ragged sob. Everyone in the room, Dominic, Jonas, the silent waiters polishing glasses, the 2 guards by the entrance, tensed up. They looked instantly toward the sound, their hands unconsciously moving toward their jackets. They were ready for anything. A rival, the police, a threat. They were not ready for this. Standing in the main entrance, hesitating for only a moment before taking a deep, panicked breath and running, was a little girl. She was so small, so tiny she looked fragile, like she might snap if the wind blew too hard. This was Lila Carver. She was only 7 years old, but right now she looked lost, terrified, and utterly alone. Her cheeks were streaked with tears that hadn't been wiped away, and her breathing was coming in high, painful gasps. She was wearing a brightly colored, cheap little backpack that looked too heavy for her small shoulders. Her light coat was half unzipped, as if she hadn't stopped long enough to fix it. Her eyes were the first thing you noticed. They were huge, soft brown eyes, usually full of innocent wonder, but now they were wide and glossy with a fear that made the whole scene feel instantly wrong. This wasn't a game. This was true, desperate panic. She didn't hesitate for the main hall. She didn't look left or right. She ran straight toward the back corner where Dominic sat. The guards didn't stop her. They were too stunned. No child had ever breached the cold formality of the vault. No one, let alone a sobbing little girl, had ever dared to run directly toward Dominic Vergano. Lila skidded to a stop right next to Dominic's booth. She was sobbing so hard now she was making strange, desperate little gulping sounds. She didn't look at his face. She couldn't even reach his shoulder. Instead, she threw her arms around his black trouser leg and held on with a fierce, shaking strength that belied her size. Dominic Vergano, the man who controlled half the city, the man whose simple frown could make hardened men sweat, froze. His hand, which had been reaching for a pen to sign a document, stopped mid-air. His expression, usually so rigid and unreadable, was a mask of pure, profound bewilderment. The entire restaurant was silent again, but this was a different kind of silence. It was heavy with shock. Jonas Vale, who had been on the verge of jumping up to intercept the girl, slowly eased back into his seat, watching his boss. He had never seen Dominic Vergano rendered speechless before. Lila held tighter, her small body shaking violently. She buried her face into the fabric of his pant leg, muffling her distress. When she finally tried to speak, it was just a series of fractured, unintelligible sounds. Dominic leaned forward slightly, his head tilting just an inch. He had never been close to a child like this. He didn't know how to react. He didn't know what to do with the intense, primal sound of this little girl's despair. "Slow down," Dominic said, his voice surprisingly soft though still deep and commanding. It was the voice you used with a frightened animal. careful, measured. Look at me. What is it? Lila finally pushed herself back enough to look up, her big brown eyes swimming in tears. Her face was red and blotchy and she was swallowing air like a fish out of water. He didn't know Dominic. Not really. She only knew what her mother, Elena, had always told her about the big, quiet man who sometimes had coffee with her at the small diner near their apartment. He's quiet, Lila. He's safe. If you ever need help, true help, you go to him. She gripped his leg one last time, closed her eyes against the tears, and finally managed to force out the terrifying words. The whole reason she had run across 3 busy streets and into this strange, dark place. He's coming, she cried out, the words piercing the thick silence of the room. He knows where we are. My mom said to run and tell you he's here. Dominic's expression shifted. The bewilderment vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense focus. He recognized the depth of the child's terror. This wasn't a scraped knee or a lost toy. This was real danger. And the words she cried, "He's coming." They rang a bell in the dark corners of his memory, a sound he had hoped never to hear again. Who, Lila? Dominic asked, his voice now low, sharp, and deadly serious. He moved his hand slowly, hesitantly, and placed it lightly on the girl's shoulder, steadying her small frame. Tell me who is coming. Lila tried to explain, but the name was trapped behind a fresh wave of sobs. She shook her head desperately, pointing vaguely back toward the city streets. The bad man. Marco. He found the place. He's at the building. The moment the name Marco left her lips, Dominic Vergano went from granite statue to a man of immediate, explosive action. His whole posture changed. His eyes narrowed, and the calculated chill that usually surrounded him turned into a flash of cold fury. Marco Silvani. The name was like a curse, a promise of old, unfinished business. Dominic knew exactly who Lila meant, and that meant he knew exactly who her mother, Elena Carver, must be. Jonas Vale, seeing the sudden violent change in his boss, leaned forward, his own voice tight. Dominic? Who's Marco? What's she talking about? Dominic didn't look at Jonas. His gaze was fixed on the shaking little girl clinging to him, but his mind was already miles away, calculating risk, speed, and defense. He stood up swiftly, detaching Lila from his leg. He didn't push her away, he just rose, forcing her to look up at him. She was still crying, but her panic was starting to give way to sheer exhaustion. He looked down at her terrified, honest, big brown eyes, and for the first time in a very long time the cold, buried heart of Dominic Vergano felt a sharp, unexpected pain. This little girl had faced something truly terrifying to run here. Jonas, Dominic commanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the renewed silence of the room. Take her. Get her water. Keep her safe. No one speaks to her. No one comes near her. Jonas was already moving, standing up to gently guide Lila away from the tense atmosphere. Dominic didn't wait. He didn't grab his coat or his keys or his phone. All the reports and the financial papers were forgotten. He had a sudden, terrifying image of Elena, Lila's mother, the nurse he barely knew, facing the threat of Marco Silvani alone. He didn't care about the history or the risk, or the fact that this little girl had just completely exposed his life in the middle of his own headquarters. He only heard the pure, desperate cry, "He's coming!" With an urgency that hadn't been seen in the vault in years, Dominic Vergano stormed out of the booth, past the stunned guards, past the frozen waiters, and straight toward the heavy wooden doors. The air he left behind felt charged and dangerous. He was a force of nature unleashed, fueled by a child's terror and a sense of duty he hadn't known he still possessed. He was going to find out what Marco Silvani wanted, and he was going to stop him. Because in that split second, looking at Lila's tear-stained face, Dominic knew he was the only chance this little girl and her mother had. Lila watched him go, tears still wetting her cheeks, but a small, steadying breath finally leaving her lungs. She was safe. She had done what her mother asked. And now, she could only hope that the terrifyingly silent man who just stormed out of the room was fast enough to save the only person she had left. Outside the vault, the city was just noise. The squeal of a tram, the urgent honk of a taxi, the steady rhythmic thump of life moving on. But inside, everything was still locked in that sudden, shocking silence caused by a 7-year-old girl's terror. Dominic Vergano hadn't just stood up and walked out. He had exploded. His right-hand man, Jonas Vale, watched the heavy wooden door swing shut behind his boss, a knot of confusion and fear tightening in his stomach. Jonas was a man who knew Dominic's moods. He knew the controlled chill, the calculating pause, and the quiet threat. This raw, uncontrolled fury, this was something different, something dangerous. Jonas immediately knelt beside Lila Carver, who was still gripping Dominic's empty trouser leg, her small chest heaving. "Hey, sweetie," Jonas said, his voice dropping to a gentle whisper, a tone the hardened security staff had never heard him use. He was usually all business, all sharp edges. But looking at Lila, so small and wet with tears, softened him. The big boss had to go take care of something. You did so good. You told him what he needed to know. Lila finally let go of the fabric. Her eyes, still wide and focused, followed the door where Dominic had vanished. She didn't look at Jonas. She was still in the middle of a nightmare. "The bad man, he's got sharp teeth," Lila whispered, her voice a small broken sound. "Mommy said he takes things. And people." Jonas gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay. You're safe here. I promise. Now come on, let's get you something warm to drink." He led her toward a quieter, more isolated booth, away from the startled waiters and the whispering guards. He was trying to be calm, trying to follow Dominic's orders, but his mind was racing. That was the name the child had screamed. He had heard that name only in whispers, only in connection to events that were ancient history for their organization. A dark period Dominic never spoke about. Meanwhile, Dominic Vargano was moving like a man possessed. He had ignored his own driver and instead jumped into the first black sedan he saw idling on the curb, shoving the startled driver out of the way and taking the wheel himself. He didn't care about the traffic laws, the rush hour, or the dozens of onlookers staring at the famous, feared Dominic Vargano driving like a maniac. His fury was not loud. It was cold and internal, a deadly chill that radiated from him. The name Lila had whispered, Marco Silvani, was like a key turning in a lock, unlocking a part of Dominic he had sealed off years ago. Marco wasn't just a rival. He was a ghost from a blood feud Dominic had sworn he had buried. A feud connected to betrayals, losses, and a past that had nearly cost him everything he had. He found her. After all this time he found Elena. Dominic knew Elena Carver only as the quiet, hard-working nurse he occasionally saw at the local 24-hour diner at 4 in the morning. He would be there finishing a late meeting. She would be there catching a quick, tired coffee break before her shift started at the large city hospital. They rarely spoke, just nods and a shared understanding of people who lived on strange schedules. But he had always felt a pull toward her, a sense that she carried a heavy, hidden weight. Now he knew what that weight was. Marco Silvani. Dominic swerved the car onto a side street, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. He grabbed the phone tucked into his console and barked an order into it. "Call Detective Rowan Hale," he commanded into the receiver, speaking to an anonymous contact he used only in moments of extreme urgency. "Tell him I have information on the cold case he's always digging into. Tell him to meet me at the old docks warehouse. Now." Dominic rarely involved the police, especially not Rowan Hale, the relentless cop who spent his life trying to connect Dominic to every shadow in the city. But Marco Silvani was not a problem for his usual security protocols. Marco was an earthquake, and Dominic needed to control the ground Marco stood on. He drove toward the address Lila had vaguely indicated, the apartment complex where Elena lived, tucked away in a quiet, multicultural neighborhood known for its small family shops and cramped, but cozy walk-up buildings. Back at the vault, Jonas was still trying to process the chaos. He had calmed Lila enough to get her sipping a warm cup of apple juice, but she hadn't stopped shaking entirely. "Tell me about your mommy, Lila," Jonas asked softly, sitting on the edge of the booth. "What does she do?" Lila looked up, her expression now shifting from pure terror to confusion, as if she was trying to remember what was safe to say. She fixes people," Lila whispered, clutching the warm glass with both hands. "She goes away when it's dark. She wears blue clothes. She says she has to hide the lights." Hide the lights. Jonas understood. Night shift nurse. Working at odd hours, blending in, avoiding attention. It perfectly matched the profile of someone running from a ghost like Marco Silvani. Elena Carver had been hiding in plain sight for years, building a simple, anonymous life for herself and her daughter. And now the past had caught up. Jonas realized the depth of the danger. Marco wouldn't just threaten Elena, he would use Lila. He gently stroked Lila's hair. "You are such a brave girl, Lila," Jonas told her, leaning close. "Running all that way. You saved your mother's life just by being fast." Lila's small, fragile face finally managed a tiny, wobbly smile at the compliment. "Mommy said you have to be quiet and fast when the dark comes." Jonas felt a rush of respect for Elena. She had clearly prepared her daughter for this nightmare scenario, trusting a casual acquaintance, Dominic Vergano, with the life of her only child. He gave her a quick hug, a small, genuine gesture of comfort. "Everything is going to be okay," Jonas assured her, though he felt a heavy responsibility settling over him. He knew Dominic was fast and terrifying when angered, but he also knew Marco Silvani was ruthless and unpredictable. Jonas pulled out his phone and made a series of quick, silent calls, mobilizing their best men not to fight, but to quietly lock down the entire perimeter of the vault. He also sent a coded message to Dominic. "Lila is safe. Location confirmed. We are locked down." He took one look at Lila, who was now leaning back against the plush velvet of the booth, the first signs of exhaustion finally claiming her. She was 7 years old, but she had just carried the weight of the world and she had delivered her message perfectly. She had trusted a stranger with a dark past, and in doing so she had forced him to face the very thing he had spent years avoiding. Jonas watched her small, steadying breaths and felt a fierce, protective loyalty surge through him. This wasn't just about Dominic's past anymore. This was about saving a mother and protecting a brave little girl who had run crying into a den of wolves and found safety. Lila closed her eyes, clutching the glass, feeling the warmth spread through her small body. She had done it. She had cried out and the quiet, scary man had listened. For the first time since her mother had shoved her out the door with a terrifying command to run, Lila felt the fragile, yet undeniable presence of hope. Across the bustling city, far from the dark silence of the vault, was a small 3-story apartment building tucked into a quiet, working-class neighborhood. This was home to Elena Carver, and for the last 7 years, it had been her fortress. Elena was 28, but the lines of stress around her eyes made her look older. She was petite with an unremarkable kind of beauty that helped her blend into the crowd, and blending in was the most important thing she did. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, practical bun, and she was dressed in the scrubs she wore for her night shift at the city hospital. She was just starting to clean up the dinner dishes, the rhythmic clink of ceramic a familiar, comforting sound. Elena was the kind of person who moved with quiet purpose. Her life was defined by routine, by caution, and by the constant low-level hum of anxiety that never quite left her. Every door locked twice, every window checked, and every strange car on the street noted. She was hiding not just from debt collectors or an angry ex, but from a truly violent shadow named Marco Silvani. Just 10 minutes earlier she had made the hardest decision of her life. She had shoved her daughter Lila out the door with a terrifying, urgent command. "Lila, listen to mommy," she had whispered, her hands gripping the child's shoulders fiercely. "You run to the vault. You find the quiet man, Dominic Vergano. You hold on to his leg and you tell him, he's coming. You run, baby. Don't look back." As she watched Lila's small, desperate figure dart down the stairs, Elena's knees had nearly buckled. It was a terrifying gamble. She was sending her daughter toward a man who was rumored to be a devil, but he was also the only person Elena had ever observed who seemed capable of dealing with the absolute darkness that was Marco. Now she was alone in the quiet apartment, waiting. She had known this day would come. She had felt it in her bones for weeks. The surveillance, the feeling of being watched, the little things out of place. It was the feeling of a hunter closing in on his prey. She picked up her phone to text her manager that she was calling out sick, when the screen flashed with an incoming message. It wasn't a contact she recognized. It was an unknown number. The message was chillingly short, simple, and utterly devastating. It used words that only someone from her secret past, the dangerous, violent past she had been running from, would know. "Found the bird cage. The canary song is over, Elena. Pay your debts." Elena froze. The porcelain plate in her hand slipped, hitting the countertop with a loud smack, but miraculously didn't break. Her breath hitched in her throat, the small, controlled world she had built crumbling around her. The bird cage. That was the pet name Marco had given the tiny, dingy apartment she had shared with him years ago. The place where she was held captive by fear, control, and emotional abuse. The canary song. That was his cruel term for the way she used to cry for help. Tears, which Elena rarely allowed herself, immediately welled up, but she furiously blinked them away. There was no time to cry. Marco had found her. He wasn't just lurking, he was sending direct threats. This was his favorite game. Announcing his presence, letting the victims stew in terror, and then making his move. Elena ran to the small wall safe hidden behind a framed picture of Lila's artwork. Her hands were shaking violently as she keyed in the code. Inside there was a worn envelope containing a small amount of cash, some forged travel documents, and one single old photograph. The photograph showed a younger Elena, smiling weakly, standing next to a man with cold, calculating eyes. This was Marco Silvani, now 45, and even in the faded photo he radiated a coiled, predatory energy. He wasn't like Dominic Vargano, whose power came from silent, controlled authority. Marco was loud, vicious, and loved the smell of chaos he created. He was a small-time mobster who specialized in loan sharking and intimidation, using violence to carve out his territory. Elena had gotten involved with him when she was young, desperate, and naive, thinking she could help him change. Instead, he had nearly destroyed her. She quickly grabbed the documents and the cash. She was prepared to run. This was Plan B, the emergency escape she had mentally rehearsed 1,000 times. But as she started stuffing them into her medical bag, she stopped. Lila was safe, she hoped, with Dominic. But if Elena ran now, truly vanished, she would never be able to come back for her daughter. Marco would know she abandoned the child. He would use Lila as bait, as leverage, or worse. She sank onto the edge of the cheap, worn sofa, the smell of dust and old linen filling her nostrils. The phone vibrated again. Another message from the unknown number. Don't bother packing, nurse. I'll see you soon. The hospital roof, 10 minutes. Bring your scrubs, you'll need them for the cleanup. The message was crueler, more specific, and utterly terrifying. It meant he was close. Not only was he outside, but he had tracked her to the place she felt most secure, the hospital where she worked. It was a threat meant to paralyze her with fear and guilt. Elena finally allowed a single tear to track down her cheek, but it was a tear of pure, determined rage, not fear. Marco wanted to play a game? Fine. But he was only going to get her, not her daughter. She stood up, tall and straight, her hands no longer shaking. She put the travel documents back in the safe. She didn't need them. She wasn't running anymore. Her greatest secret, the painful history with Marco, was now exposed, and she had nothing left to lose. She walked purposefully toward the front door, slipping her hospital badge into her pocket. She had sent her only child to the most dangerous man in the city for protection. Now she had to go face her nightmare, trusting that Dominic Vargano, the quiet, formidable man who drank coffee alone at 4 a.m, would honor the silent pact and keep Lila safe. As she stepped out of her apartment and locked the door, for the last time she suspected, she thought about Lila's tiny, terrified face. That thought was the fuel she needed. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a mother fighting for her child's future. She would go to the hospital roof and she would face Marco Silvani alone, whatever the cost. The canary song was over. The fight was beginning. The key turned with a dull, final click in the lock. Elena took a deep breath of the city air. It smelled of exhaust and rain, but to her, it smelled like a strange, terrifying kind of freedom. She was walking into the fire, but her heart was lighter, knowing her daughter was in the hands of the one person who could truly protect her. Dominic Vargano drove like the fury of the storm he was trying to outrun. The black sedan screamed through the city streets, ignoring traffic signals and weaving expertly through the late afternoon rush. His face was a mask of cold, hard purpose. He wasn't just angry, he was betrayed by history. He hadn't been this close to pure, volatile rage in over a decade. The shock of seeing Lila's terrified face, the simple, devastating words, "He's coming." And then that name, Marco Silvani, had ripped open an old scar. Dominic pulled the car to a shuddering stop near the apartment complex Lila had fled. It was a simple, beige building, entirely unremarkable. He didn't see any immediate signs of trouble. No flashing lights, no screaming, just the quiet rhythm of a neighborhood getting home from work. But he knew Marco's style. Marco didn't create spectacle. He created terror, often in chilling silence. He pulled his phone out again, dialing Jonas Vale back at the vault. The second Jonas answered, Dominic didn't waste a second on greetings. "Get me everything. Dominic commanded, his voice low and vibrating with tension. Everything we have on Marco Silvani. Past dealings, recent activities, whatever whispers are out there. I want a map of his movements for the last 3 months, starting yesterday. I want to know how he found Elena Carver. Jonas's voice, usually so steady, sounded taut with concern. Boss, we're working on it. But everything on Marco is ancient history. We thought he was dead. The word was he got caught up in a South American job gone bad maybe 7 years ago. A boat exploded. Dominic gripped the phone tighter. He's not dead. He's here. And he's found Elena. 7 years ago? That matches the timeline. Elena disappeared around that time too. He realized the terrifying connection instantly. Elena hadn't just run from a bad relationship. She had fled the city because Marco was trying to drag her into the violence, or worse, because he had put her in danger. She had hidden her life, her daughter, and her identity, believing the threat was buried. And all this time Marco had simply been resurfacing, slowly tracking her like a predator. Dominic had to force his mind back to the present. He wasn't dealing with a low-level rival. He was dealing with the unpredictable monster he had faced in his own early days. A man who enjoyed causing pain more than he enjoyed making money. Jonas, listen to me, Dominic continued, his tone softening slightly as he looked at the apartment building. Elena is a nurse. She works the night shift at St. Jude's Hospital downtown. Marco just sent her a message. He's going to the hospital roof in 10 minutes. He wants to meet her. It's a trap, but she's going. Jonas's sharp gasp came through the phone. The hospital. We can't storm a hospital, boss. Too many innocent people. I know, Dominic muttered, already turning the car toward the hospital's direction. But I need to buy her time. And I need to find out why he came after her now, after 7 years of quiet. He hung up, the car already moving again, faster this time. As he drove, he remembered the old history, the shared rivalry, the near-fatal conflict he and Marco had years ago. A conflict that had established Dominic as the cold, calculating leader he was today, and that had banished Marco from the city. Marco Silvani had always been envious of Dominic's control and cold power. Marco thrived on chaos, intimidation, and raw, visible cruelty. Dominic had always preferred the shadows, the calculations, the quiet command. They were two different kinds of predators, and their past business had ended with a devastating confrontation that left Marco severely weakened and presumably out of the picture for good. Now Marco's return wasn't just about Elena. It was a challenge. It was a move against Dominic's territory, a personal vendetta wrapped up in the life of a frightened nurse. Dominic looked out at the gleaming modern glass tower of St. Jude's Hospital rising into the pale evening sky. He was not just protecting Elena and Lila. He was protecting his own peace, the stability he had fought so hard to create. He was protecting his commitment to the terrified little girl who had clung to his pant leg like a lifeline. He pulled his car into the narrow delivery-only lane behind the hospital, the sounds of distant sirens and urban life fading around him. He didn't stop to think about the risk or the fact that he was walking into a situation that had nearly cost him his life once before. He only thought of Lila's cry, "He's coming." He exited the car, his imposing figure moving with dangerous speed. He pulled open the delivery door to the hospital, his mind entirely focused on the roof, the trap, and the ghost he was finally going to silence for good. This time, Dominic wasn't just protecting a debt or a territory. He was protecting innocence, a concept he rarely encountered and didn't fully understand, but one he knew he couldn't let Marco Silvani destroy. Dominic felt the familiar weight of old conflict settle upon him, heavier than any suit of armor. He was facing a ghost from his past, and he wouldn't rest until he could look at Lila's mother, Elena, and tell her that the nightmare was truly over. Dominic Vergano burst through the service door of St. Jude's Hospital, the cold, stale air of the hallway hitting him as a sudden, sharp contrast to the furious heat in his chest. He was moving, but his mind was already 7 years in the past, running alongside him. He hadn't been to this hospital in a long time, but he knew the layout. The fire escape stairs led straight up to the roof. He took them 2 steps at a time, the sound of his heavy, expensive shoes echoing loudly in the narrow stairwell. He was coming for a meeting, but not the kind where hands were shaken or deals were struck. As he pounded up the concrete steps, the memory hit him not as a fuzzy dream, but with the painful clarity of a fresh wound. It was a night of rain and chaos 7 years ago in a dingy, forgotten warehouse district near the old docks. Dominic, younger, leaner, and freshly rising to power, was leading a highly volatile takeover of a rival's assets. It was a messy, brutal operation, the kind of ugly business he later refined into silent, clinical transactions. The warehouse had been a maze of storage crates and shadows, riddled with gunfire and shouts. Dominic and his men were securing the territory when they heard a desperate, choked scream coming from a tiny makeshift office tucked in the back. Dominic didn't hesitate. He kicked the thin metal door open. The scene inside was terrifying. A furious, screaming man, Marco Silvani, though Dominic didn't recognize him in the chaos, was dragging a young woman by the arm. The woman was small, slender, and absolutely consumed by panic. That woman was Elena. She wasn't part of the operation. She was just collateral, someone Marco had dragged there to prove a point to the rival boss he was working for. Marco, seeing Dominic and his team burst in, shoved Elena away violently, using her as a shield to draw their fire. Elena stumbled backward, landing hard against a stack of crates, tears streaming down her face. She was bruised, terrified, and utterly powerless. In that split second, Dominic saw the difference between the criminals and the innocent. He saw the genuine, unadulterated fear in her eyes. Despite the raging gunfight and the critical mission he was on, Dominic didn't aim at Marco. He focused on saving the victim. He spun toward two of his men. "Get her out. No. Through the back tunnel. I don't care about anything else, just her." Marco, using the diversion, fired a wild shot that narrowly missed Dominic's head before disappearing into the shadows. Dominic's men immediately moved, one covering their escape while the other grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. She looked back over her shoulder, her eyes wide, staring directly at Dominic. The chaos, the fear, the smell of gunpowder, all of it faded for just a moment as their eyes met. She saw not the hardened criminal leader, but the man who had, against all logic, chosen to save her life. "Who?" she started to ask, her voice raw. "Go," the man pulling her commanded, cutting her off. "Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run." They hauled her out, disappearing into a maintenance tunnel that led miles away. Dominic never saw her face again, but the image, the sheer terror mixed with a flicker of desperate gratitude, had stuck with him. He had known her only as the girl who Marco almost destroyed. He never learned her name and she never learned his. He simply classified her as an innocent he had managed to pull out of the fire, one small forgotten detail in a large brutal operation. Dominic slammed through the final fire door leading onto the hospital roof, the chilly evening air and the distant city lights immediately hitting him. The memory snapped back into the present. Lena Carver. The nurse from the diner. The mother of the little girl who had clung to his leg. He was that girl. The shock was profound. The world, which Dominic thought he controlled with logic and calculation, had just delivered the ultimate twist of fate. He had saved her 7 years ago without knowing who she was, and now her daughter had run to him for the very same reason: protection from Marco Silvani. He found Elena standing alone in the center of the dark, empty roof, a small, courageous figure waiting for her tormentor. The city lights cast long, stark shadows around her. She was wearing her blue scrubs, looking exactly as she did at the diner, except now her posture was stiff with fear and determination. She turned at the sound of the door opening, her eyes wide with apprehension. But when she saw Dominic, her expression crumpled, not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming recognition. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She hadn't forgotten the man who had looked at her with something other than lust or violence in that dark warehouse. "You're the one. From the docks." Dominic walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, his fury temporarily replaced by a cold, almost surgical intensity. "Your daughter," Dominic stated, cutting straight to the present danger, ignoring the ancient history for now. "Lila is safe. She's with Jonas. Don't worry about her." Elena let out a shaky breath, a wave of relief washing over her face that was so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. "Thank God. I told her to trust you even though I didn't know your name. I just knew you were safe." "Marco is not safe," Dominic warned, closing the distance between them. "He's coming here." Why now, Elena? What did he want from you 7 years ago that's worth dragging him back from the dead?" Elena shook her head bitterly, clutching her hands together. "It wasn't me, not really. It was my cousin, Peter. Peter stole a ledger from Marco. Financial secrets. The kind of thing that could send Marco away for life. Peter gave the book to me just before Marco's men killed him. I was going to turn it over to the police, but I got scared. Marco tracked me to that warehouse. You saved me before I could. Where is it now? Dominic demanded, his eyes scanning the rooftop, knowing Marco could appear at any moment. Buried, she said simply. I buried it with Peter's things. He told me to keep it safe. Marco thinks I'm going to use it for leverage, but I just wanted to disappear. A sudden sound, the distinct heavy clang of the other rooftop access door being forced open, cut their conversation short. Dominic immediately stepped in front of Elena, his massive frame shielding her completely. He looked toward the door, his eyes narrowed into slits. He's here, Dominic stated, his voice a low rumble. Stay behind me, Elena. This is where the price for that ledger gets paid. The man who stepped onto the roof was exactly as Dominic remembered. Slick, slightly too loud, and radiating an unsettling blend of arrogance and suppressed violence. Marco Silvani. He looked right past Dominic, his eyes fixed on Elena, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, the little canary found a bodyguard, Marco sneered, his voice carrying clearly across the roof. And look who it is. Dominic Vergano. I should have known you were too stupid to mind your own business. Seems like you just can't resist cleaning up my messes, can you? Dominic stood his ground, the familiar enemy now just yards away. He was furious not just at the threat to Elena, but at the painful, chaotic history Marco represented. This time he wouldn't just save her and disappear. This time the debt was personal, sealed by a terrified little girl's desperate cry. The two dangerous men faced each other under the cold, watchful eye of the city lights. Elena watched from behind Dominic, the memory of his kindness from years ago now colliding with the terrifying reality of his present power. She was scared, but for the first time in a very long time she was not alone. The forbidden connection had become her shield and her only hope. Back at the quiet, high-stakes atmosphere of the vault, a different kind of storm was brewing. Jonas Vale had managed to settle Lila into a corner booth, where she was finally sleeping, curled up like a kitten with her cheek resting against a velvet cushion. He was overseeing the perimeter security and simultaneously digging into the history of Marco Silvani when the phone rang. A number Jonas immediately recognized as highly sensitive. It was the contact for Detective Rowan Hale. Jonas took the call in a private hallway, his voice dropping to a low, guarded tone. You called me, Jonas stated, skipping the pleasantries. Dominic has an emergency. We need eyes on the old docks warehouse tonight. A voice on the other end, sharp and unrelenting, belonged to Detective Rowan Hale. Rowan was 34, clean-cut and perpetually wired. He wasn't like the other cops, he didn't care about low-level street crime. He cared about the untouchables, and at the top of his list was Dominic Vergano. Rowan had spent years trying to connect Dominic to a notorious but unsolved murder. A case that had gone ice cold. An emergency, huh? Rowan's voice was laced with sarcasm and a dangerous edge of curiosity. I heard about the emergency. A little girl running into the vault screaming her head off. That's a new one even for you people. Dominic Vergano doesn't break his stride for anything less than a declaration of war. What did the child say, Jonas? Jonas remained steady, feeding the detective only the bare minimum of information, enough to distract him but not enough to compromise Elena or Lila. It's a loose end from an old rival. Nothing for the police. Just tell me what you found at the docks. Don't play games, Jonas, Rowan snapped, his tone darkening. You think I'm blind? You think I don't follow the breadcrumbs? Your boss goes from 0 to 100 because of a sobbing kid, and suddenly he's tipping me off about a derelict warehouse? That tells me this is personal and it's connected. Rowan paused, and when he spoke again his voice was chillingly calm. I have a file here, Jonas. Dr. David Carver murder. 7 years ago. Brutal, unsolved. The victim's wife and infant daughter vanished the day after the murder. The wife's name was Elena Carver. The little girl would be about 7 now. Does that sound familiar? Jonas's grip tightened on the phone, a cold spike of alarm shooting through him. He hadn't put the pieces together, but the detective, the one man Dominic wanted to keep out of their business, had just laid their entire hidden history bare. Dr. Carver was one of the key witnesses set to testify against Marco Silvani's organization, Rowan continued, stacking the facts meticulously. He was murdered hours before he was supposed to go into protective custody. His wife, Elena, was the nurse who was going to take the ledger he'd been keeping. She disappeared and the ledger was never found. We always suspected Dominic had a connection to the case, either cleaning up a mess or creating one. Jonas quickly rallied, trying to sound bored. This is ancient history, detective. What does any of this have to do with Dominic driving fast tonight? It has everything to do with it, Rowan countered, a small, triumphant tone entering his voice. Because if that little girl is Lila Carver, the daughter of the murdered doctor, and she screamed the name of the man who killed her father, Marco Silvani, then this isn't an old rival. It's a cold case suddenly boiling over. And if Dominic Vargano is involved, it means he's either protecting the victim or protecting the person who caused the murder. The silence stretched between them, thick with accusation. Rowan Hale didn't need a confession. He just needed confirmation that his theory was correct, and Jonas's silence was confirmation enough. I need to know where Dominic went after he left your restaurant, Rowan demanded. Is he meeting Marco Silvani? Is he trying to finish a job he started 7 years ago? You bring me Marco and I'll forget I saw that little girl today, Jonas. Otherwise, I'm putting out an all-points bulletin for Dominic Vargano, wanted for questioning in connection with a renewed threat to a protected witness. Jonas knew he was trapped. He couldn't lie because Rowan already had the entire puzzle mapped out. But he couldn't betray Dominic either. He went to St. Jude's Hospital, Jonas admitted, choosing to give the location, not the reason. He's on the roof. I don't know why. That's all I have. Rowan let out a low whistle of disbelief. A hospital roof. How dramatic. You just gave me enough, Jonas. The widow is a night shift nurse there. He's meeting Elena Carver. I knew it. Dominic always plays the hero too late. Before Jonas could respond, the line went dead. Jonas immediately contacted his closest security detail, relaying the new and terrifying urgency. Detective Hale is on the move. He knows where the boss is. He knows the case. Get to St. Jude's and intercept the detective. Discreetly. He hung up the phone and walked back into the vault's main room. He looked at the peacefully sleeping Lila. He looked at the chaos they had created just by walking into Dominic's life. The little girl had pulled the pin on a grenade of history that involved Dominic, Elena, Marco, a violent murder, and a determined detective. Jonas walked over to the booth and gently placed a thick, warm blanket over Lila's small frame. He looked down at her, the last piece of an old, bloody puzzle. He knew that the confrontation on the hospital roof was no longer just a battle between Dominic and Marco. With Detective Hale now in motion, it was about to become a desperate race to control the truth before the police, and the entire city, learn the full story of Elena Carver and the cold case that had just been warmed by a little girl's tearful scream. Back in the hushed, heavily guarded confines of the vault, the tension hadn't broken. It had simply shifted. With Dominic and Elena facing the dangerous ghost of Marco Silvani at the hospital, Jonas Vale was left with the most vulnerable piece of the entire puzzle. Lila Carver. Lila was no longer crying, but the terror was still etched into her small 7-year-old face. She was awake now, sitting up, watching the silent, watchful men around her with her wide, brown eyes. Jonas sat across from her, his usual hard exterior completely softened by the need to protect this child. He needed to know how Marco had found them, and the answer lay with Lila. Lila, Jonas began softly, leaning forward. You are the bravest girl I have ever met. You saved your mom. But I need you to tell me something important. Can you tell me what happened today before you ran here? What did the bad man do? Lila clutched the warm mug of cocoa Jonas had given her, the steam rising around her nose. She looked down at the dark liquid, speaking in a whisper so faint Jonas had to strain to hear. I was waiting by the big gates, she started, referring to her schoolyard. Mommy always picks me up. But today she was late because she had to go to the hospital early. She paused, taking a shaky breath, the memory clearly upsetting her. I was reading my book, waiting. And then a car came. A dark one. It stopped and he got out. Jonas kept his voice even and steady, nodding for her to continue. The man you call Marco? Lila nodded, her bottom lip starting to tremble. He looked mean. He didn't smile. He had a scratch on his face. She described how Marco hadn't shouted or grabbed her violently, which would have drawn attention. Instead, he had walked up to her, moving quickly and quietly, his presence feeling massive and overwhelming to her small self. He didn't yell. He just whispered, Lila said, and she shivered, the memory of his closeness making her shrink back against the velvet seat. He leaned down and he said, well, look at the little bird. All grown up. He called me little bird, like my mommy does sometimes, but his voice was scary. Jonas felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. Marco had used intimacy, a pet name, to weaponize the terror, making the threat feel personal and inescapable. What did he whisper next, Lila? Jonas asked, his voice barely above a plea. Lila closed her eyes, trying to recall the exact terrifying words. He said, tell your nurse mommy that I found her. I know where she hides her secrets. Tell her I'll be back tonight to collect my things. Tell her the game is over and I win. She opened her eyes, tears returning, but held them back with a desperate will. He said, run home, little bird. Run and tell your mother to wait for me. And then he laughed. A quiet, scary laugh. And he just drove away. The detail was chilling. Marco hadn't just found the apartment. He had intercepted the child at her school, confirming her routine and her vulnerability. He had played a cruel, calculated mind game, using Lila as a terrified messenger, knowing she would run straight home and alert her mother, giving Elena just enough time to panic before his arrival. Jonas leaned back slowly, processing the horrific reality. This 7-year-old girl hadn't just run into their headquarters on a whim. She had been actively confronted, threatened, and used as bait by a genuinely vicious criminal. She had walked through her entire afternoon. School, the walk home, the fear, carrying the weight of her mother's deadly secret, without anyone in her small world suspecting the terror she was enduring. The men in the vault, hardened by years of dealing with organized crime, exchanged uncomfortable glances. They realized this wasn't just a business transaction that had gone sour. It was the story of a child living in the shadow of relentless, silent danger. Jonas stood up, walking over to the nearest guard, his voice hard and low. Call the city school district. I want to know who works at Lila's school. I want to know if anyone saw Marco's car, if anyone saw him near the gates. He used the child as a delivery service. He cannot walk away from this. He returned to Lila, his face grave. Did your mother know he was coming back, Lila? Did she know he was watching the school? Lila shook her head. No. When I told her, she just turned white. Like the wall. She hugged me so tight it hurt and she said, I'm so sorry, baby. I failed you. And then she told me to run to you. I failed you. The simple, heartbreaking honesty of the mother's terror resonated deeply with Jonas. Elena Carver, the night shift nurse, had carried the burden of protecting her daughter from a ghost for 7 years. And in one afternoon, that ghost had reached out and touched her child. Jonas reached out and gently took the empty mug from Lila's hands. He knelt down again, bringing his face close to hers, looking straight into her brown, brave eyes. You didn't fail anyone, Lila, he said, his voice husky with emotion. You were the smartest, bravest thing in that whole terrible story. You were given a terrifying message and you delivered it to the one man who could help. You didn't fail. You won. You brought help here. He watched the little girl finally let go of the tension. Her eyelids drooped and a small, peaceful sigh escaped her lips. The adrenaline was finally leaving her small body, replaced by the profound exhaustion of having carried the world's weight on her shoulders. She curled up again, drawing the blanket higher. Jonas looked at the child sleeping soundly, finally safe within the walls of the terrifying fortress. He felt a fierce, renewed loyalty to Dominic. Whatever happened on that hospital roof, the reason for it was sleeping right here, and she had to wake up to a world where she was finally free. Lila's small, quiet story, delivered in the hushed corner of a Mafia headquarters, had done more than just relay a threat. It had stripped away the layers of business and rivalry, revealing the raw, undeniable core of the conflict. A ruthless man's terror against a mother's fierce, desperate love. The hospital rooftop was freezing, the wind whipping around the towering ventilation units. Dominic Vargano and Marco Silvani stood facing each other, the glow of the distant city lights illuminating the decades of violent history between them. Behind Dominic, Elena Carver stood frozen, watching the confrontation unfold. You always were slow, Dominic, Marco sneered, adjusting the expensive jacket he wore. His face was hard, the scratch Lila had mentioned visible along his jawline. I told her 10 minutes. You took 15. Sloppy. That's why you'll never see the big picture. Dominic ignored the insult, his focus razor sharp. The big picture is that you are threatening an innocent woman and her child to get a ledger that is long gone. You should have stayed dead, Marco. Innocent. Marco let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed across the roof. There are no innocents in your world, Dominic. She holds the proof that would burn my organization to the ground. She took it from her hero husband, the doctor, and she ran. She's a thief and a traitor. She's a nurse who got caught in your crossfire, Dominic corrected, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. And now she is under my protection. You want the ledger? You deal with me. Marco took a step back, raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. I knew you'd say that. Always the protector, aren't you? But I don't need the ledger now, Dominic. I just needed the location. I needed Elena to be frightened enough to run back to you. Because the ledger is just a book. But you are the real prize. Before Dominic could respond, a low, buzzing vibration came from his pocket. He ignored it for a moment, but Marco's eyes shifted, a cruel glint entering them. Answer it, Dominic, Marco instructed, a chilling calmness in his voice. I bet it's your loyal dog, Jonas Vale. He's probably calling to tell you about the police coming, isn't he? Or maybe, he's calling to tell you about the doctor's wife he had to handle a few years ago. That little cleanup job you never knew about. The air thickened instantly. Dominic finally pulled out his phone, his hand steady despite the sudden, shocking implication. The call was indeed from Jonas. Dominic answered, putting the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Marco. Talk, Dominic commanded, his voice dangerously quiet. Meanwhile, back at the vault, Jonas Vale had just finished his hurried conversation with Detective Rowan Hale. He knew he had to warn Dominic, but he also had another, more pressing call to make. He walked into the stairwell, away from the sleeping Lila and the watchful men. His hand, however, did not dial Dominic. Instead, he dialed a secured burner phone, a number that belonged only to Marco Silvani. Jonas's face, usually so calm and measured, was strained with conflict and fear. It's done, Jonas whispered urgently into the phone. I told him about the hospital roof. He's there now facing you. But the police are coming, Marco. Rowan Hale knows about Elena Carver and the doctor's murder. He's putting it all together. A low, confident chuckle came from the other end, Marco's voice. Good. You did well, Jonas. You always do. That little girl running to Dominic was the perfect distraction. It pushed Dominic right where I needed him, out in the open, focused on the pretty nurse. You warned the detective knowing he'd chase Dominic, giving me exactly the chaos I need. It's getting too hot, Marco, Jonas pleaded, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. The doctor's murder 7 years ago? Dominic never knew I was the one who was ordered to clean up that mess, to make sure there were no witnesses. I kept it quiet for you. I kept his wife quiet, but I never killed her. Dominic would kill me if he knew I was holding back that kind of information about a cold case. Jonas Vale was not just Dominic's right hand. He was Marco's secret, terrified asset. 7 years ago, when the doctor who was going to testify against Marco was murdered, Dominic had ordered Jonas to make sure the widow, Elena, was taken care of, protected, or quietly sent away, whatever it took to keep the organization clean. But Marco had gotten to Jonas first, threatening his family. Jonas had promised Marco he would let Elena go, but ensure she disappeared and never returned, keeping the ledger and the crime hidden from Dominic. It was a secret debt. A silent, corrosive betrayal that had kept Marco's life intact and had placed Jonas under Marco's thumb ever since. You're safe, Jonas, Marco's voice purred, confidence oozing through the phone. You just keep the little bird asleep and keep the police at bay. Dominic goes down tonight for protecting the widow of a key witness, and you become the most valuable asset in the city. Now, I have to go finish my meeting with the hero. Jonas hung up, breathing hard. He quickly sent a nonverbal coded text to Dominic's secure line. Police inbound. Dock warehouse cleanup. The coded message warned Dominic that the police were involved in the Marco Silvani/Dr. Carver history, but it didn't reveal Jonas's own involvement or the depth of his betrayal. He had warned Dominic, but he had still protected Marco, his silent enemy and true master. Back on the roof, Dominic was still on the phone, receiving Jonas's urgent coded text. He looked at Marco, understanding dawning, chilling his blood. The police are coming, Dominic confirmed, hanging up the phone. They've tied you to a murder 7 years ago. The murder of Dr. David Carver. Elena's husband. Marco smiled, that horrible knowing smile. And who do you think told them where to find you? Not Elena. Not me. A friend, Dominic. A very, very loyal friend. The realization slammed into Dominic. Marco knew the details of the police investigation. He knew where Dominic was headed. Someone inside was feeding him information, and the most logical, most trusted source was Jonas. The sudden violent shift of the confrontation, the chaos, the police. It all pointed to a masterful setup orchestrated by Marco and executed by a traitor. Dominic didn't need proof. He saw the gleeful malice in Marco's eyes, a look that said, I win either way. Dead or arrested, you lose everything. You're right, Dominic said, stepping fully away from Elena and towards Marco. I am slow. But only once. Dominic lunged, not with a gun, but with the brutal, precise efficiency of a man who dealt in physical dominance. He was furious, the betrayal by his closest man adding a dangerous, uncontrolled edge to his power. The air was split by the fierce sound of a fight erupting, two powerful, desperate men struggling on the precipice of a high rise, under the cold, indifferent stars. Elena watched, clutching her chest, realizing the price of her daughter's safety was now being paid in blood and explosive, agonizing betrayal. The fight raged on the rooftop, a desperate scramble between old rivals and new betrayals. The war that had started with a child's cry and a mother's fear was now a violent, ugly battle for survival, with Dominic Vergano's life and the stability of his entire world hanging in the balance. The rooftop fight had been brutal and fast. Dominic Vergano, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of fury and betrayal, had moved with a deadly precision that caught Marco Silvani entirely off guard. Dominic was focused on survival and information, not revenge. He landed a clean, devastating blow that sent Marco reeling back, slamming against a large ventilation unit. Where are your men? Dominic snarled, his voice ragged. Are they at the vault? Are they after Lila? Marco, spitting blood and fighting to breathe, only laughed maniacally. The little bird is safe for now. My men are where they should be, Dominic. Cleaning up my loose ends. That was all Dominic needed. Loose ends. He knew Marco meant Elena. He hadn't sent his men after the child. He had sent them to the apartment to retrieve the ledger and silence the nurse who held his secret. Dominic didn't wait for another move. He delivered one final crushing kick, leaving Marco slumped and injured on the cold roof. He turned to Elena, whose face was pale with shock and fear, but who was still standing tall. The ledger, Dominic commanded, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the emergency stairs. We have to get it. Now. Elena, seeing the sheer force and fury in him, didn't argue. She simply nodded and matched his frantic pace down the concrete stairwell. The betrayal of Jonas and the confrontation with Marco had made everything terrifyingly clear. The ledger was the only thing standing between Marco and the destruction of her and her daughter's life. They burst out of the hospital and into Dominic's waiting car. Dominic drove faster than before, pushing the sedan through the city streets toward Elena's small, quiet neighborhood. Marco wanted you to run to me, Dominic explained quickly, his eyes fixed on the road. He set this up. He knew the police would follow me, thinking I was the criminal, leaving his men free to go after you and the evidence. Elena gripped the dashboard. He knew I would go to you because of that night 7 years ago at the docks, she realized, the connection finally solidifying in her mind. He must have been watching me ever since. He knew you were the only person I trusted enough to save Lila. He knew I saved you, yes, Dominic confirmed, the bitterness of the memory clear in his voice. But I didn't know who you were until tonight. I only knew Marco's mess had entangled an innocent. That night I just ordered my men to get you out. You didn't even know my name, Elena murmured, a wave of complicated emotions washing over her, relief, astonishment, and a strange, profound sense of gratitude. The man who had haunted the edges of her memory as her anonymous savior was the same brutal, feared figure who was now risking everything to protect her child. As they screeched to a halt in front of Elena's apartment building, the reason for Dominic's urgent, reckless speed became brutally clear. Two large, rough-looking men were standing by Elena's third-floor window, their faces covered. One of them was already using a crowbar to pry the lock on the fire escape door that led onto her small balcony. The sound of splintering wood and groaning metal cut through the evening quiet. Marco's men, Dominic growled, slamming the car door shut. They're not waiting for a key. Stay here, Lena. This is not your fight. But Elena was already out of the car, sprinting toward the building entrance. They'll be in my apartment in 30 seconds. The ledger is under the floorboards in the closet. I'm the only one who can get it. Dominic cursed under his breath, realizing he couldn't leave her. He ran up the stairs behind her, drawing a silenced pistol. A precaution he always took even when driving to a diner. They reached the third floor just as the two goons were about to shoulder barge the main apartment door. The moment the men heard the footsteps, they spun around, their faces tightening with surprise at seeing Dominic Vergano. They recognized him instantly. His reputation was a wall of fear in the criminal world. "You," one of them yelled, dropping the crowbar. "Marco said you were busy at the hospital." "Marco was mistaken," Dominic stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a cold hammer blow. The men didn't reach for their guns. They knew the odds. Instead they panicked and rushed Dominic, trying to tackle him. They were strong, but Dominic was a whirlwind of controlled, brutal force. He struck the first man with a precise, crippling blow to the side, sending him sprawling. As the second man charged, Dominic sidestepped him, using his momentum to slam him into the concrete wall. The crack was sickeningly loud. Elena was already fumbling with her key in the apartment lock, her hands shaking violently, ignoring the brutal fight happening just feet behind her. "Hurry, Elena," Dominic urged, momentarily holding off the first attacker who was staggering back to his feet. She finally turned the lock and shoved the door open, darting inside. Dominic followed immediately, kicking the first attacker who tried to follow, slamming the door shut and engaging the deadbolt just as the second man hit the door with his shoulder. "The closet. Now," Dominic yelled, positioning himself just inside the entrance, gun raised, ready for the men to break through the reinforced lock. Elena ran to the small bedroom closet. Her face was streaked with sweat and fear, but her movements were focused. She yanked out a small pile of winter coats and began furiously tearing at the floorboards at the back of the closet, her small nurse's hands digging under the cheap wood. She finally found the loose one, pulled it back and reached into the darkness. Just as she pulled out a thick leather-bound book, the infamous ledger, the apartment door splintered violently, and the sound of heavy boots echoed in the small hallway. "We found it!" Elena cried out, clutching the book like a shield. Dominic didn't look. He fired a quick, non-fatal warning shot into the ceiling, the deafening bang shocking the two men into a momentary, stunned halt. "The ledger is gone," Dominic bellowed through the shattered doorway, his voice a promise of utter devastation. "Tell Marco he loses. Get out of here now or I finish what I started on the roof." The threat, combined with the presence of their injured boss and the sudden sound of a gunshot, was enough. The two thugs scrambled back down the stairs in a panicked retreat. Dominic slowly lowered his weapon, his chest heaving, listening to the pounding retreat of the men. He looked at Elena, standing small in the corner of the room, clutching the dark, dangerous book to her chest. Her eyes met his, and in that moment she wasn't looking at a monster or a criminal. She was looking at the fierce, determined man who had twice saved her life, completely exposing himself to danger in the process. "We have it," Elena whispered, her voice filled with a profound, dizzying relief. "We have the proof." Dominic walked toward her, the tension slowly draining from his rigid posture. He reached out and gently took the ledger from her hands, his thumb brushing against the worn leather. He looked at the book, then back at Elena, who was starting to cry, but these were tears of exhaustion and release. "Lila is safe," Dominic said, his voice surprisingly gentle, focusing on the only thing that truly mattered. "Now so are you." He had risked his entire organization, his freedom and his life, but holding that ledger, knowing that the little girl was safe, gave him a sense of hard-won victory that was unfamiliar and strangely, deeply satisfying. Elena sank onto the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, the danger finally receding. She had run from one dangerous man for 7 years, only to be saved by another, more formidable one. Looking at Dominic Vergano, her silent protector twice over, she felt a rush of overwhelming relief and the beginnings of a love, not of romance but of utter life-saving trust. With the splintered door locked and the sounds of the retreating goons fading into the night, the small, tense apartment finally fell silent. Elena Carver and Dominic Vergano stood in the middle of the wreckage, the worn, leather-bound ledger lying on the kitchen table between them. Dominic, still breathing heavily from the fight, looked at the book, not as a simple document, but as the reason for 7 years of fear and 1 night of explosive violence. He looked at Elena, who was now calmer, the immediate adrenaline rush replaced by a grim determination. "We need to talk about what's in this book, Elena," Dominic stated, his eyes searching hers for the whole truth. "Marco doesn't risk everything for a simple accounting ledger. He nearly killed a child's mother and risked exposing himself to me and the police. This is bigger than money. It's about a crime he can't afford to let anyone see." Elena nodded slowly, walking over to the window to pull the curtain shut, a reflex born of years of hiding. She turned back, her expression one of painful resignation. The time for secrets was over. "It started with my husband, Dr. David Carver," Elena began, her voice soft but steady. "He was a vascular surgeon at St. Jude's Hospital. A good man. He was worried about things he was seeing. Patients coming in with fresh, deep incisions that weren't surgery scars. People who were sick and suddenly got worse after an anonymous donation was made to pay their bills." She walked toward the table, placing her hand on the dark cover of the book. David started looking into it. He was seeing patterns in the hospital's accounting, specifically in the surgical supply chain and the organ donor registry. He realized Marco Silvani wasn't just a lone shark. He was running a lucrative, brutal organ trafficking ring. Dominic stiffened. This was far worse than he had imagined. Drug deals, protection rackets, even murder. Those were the dirty games of the city. But organ trafficking was a crime of pure, cold horror, preying on the most vulnerable. It explained the extreme level of Marco's paranoia and violence. David began keeping a separate record, Elena continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. A true record of the names, the suspicious hospital transfers, the dates and the coded payments. He hid it inside a medical records book, a blank one, and made it look like a personal journal. This is that ledger." Dominic reached out and opened the book. Inside were pages filled with meticulous, small handwriting, lists of dates, patient codes, and financial transfers to shell corporations, all evidence of a horrific scheme that reached deep into the medical world. "Marco found out," Elena whispered, the pain of the memory clear in her voice. "David was planning to go to the police with this evidence, with the help of a detective he trusted. But Marco had an informant, a dirty cop, or maybe even someone in the hospital administration. He found David on the night David was supposed to go into protective custody." Elena's control finally broke, a wave of anguish washing over her. "Marco killed him. He killed David right there in our own home looking for this book. I found David. I found him an hour later and I knew I had to run. I had Lila, she was just a baby, and Marco's men were everywhere." She pointed at the ledger. "I managed to grab this, but Marco saw me. He never got his hands on it. That night at the docks, the night you saved me, he was trying to kidnap me to find out where I hid it. When I disappeared, he eventually had to assume I was dead or out of the country, but he never stopped searching. He believes, even after 7 years, that the ledger is still the key to destroying him." Dominic looked from the evidence-filled pages to Elena. He finally understood the gravity of the cold case, the ruthless intensity of Marco, and the immense burden this woman had carried alone. She wasn't just a nurse hiding from a violent ex. She was a widow protecting the evidence of her husband's murder and a massive criminal enterprise. "This book doesn't just put Marco in jail, Elena," Dominic said, his voice grim. "This tears his entire ugly world apart. It exposes the corruption he's planted in the system. That's why he didn't just send men to kill you, he sent them to retrieve the evidence." He closed the ledger, the weight of the book now feeling heavy with the lives it represented. "Marco thinks you still have this," Dominic continued, his mind already forming a strategy. "He doesn't know you managed to hide it for 7 years and just retrieved it now. He thinks it's been the reason you've been running all this time. We need to use that. We need to let him think he still has a chance to get it." Elena looked at him, her eyes wide with a fragile hope. "Can you stop him, Dominic? Can you use that book to make sure he never hurts anyone again? Especially Lila?" Dominic looked at the scared but brave woman, the widow who had survived years of looking over her shoulder. He thought of the sleeping child, the little girl who had run screaming to him for help. "We have the proof," Dominic confirmed, his voice firming into an unbreakable promise. "We have the motives. We have the enemy exposed. And we have the one man who betrayed me. This is no longer just your fight, Elena. It's mine now. And Marco Silvani is about to learn what happens when you threaten the people I choose to protect. Elena watched him, seeing not the feared mafia boss, but the ruthless, determined protector of her family. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the possibility of justice, and the overwhelming comfort of knowing that her long, lonely nightmare was finally drawing to a close. The sun was beginning to rise, casting pale, anxious light across the city. Dominic Vargano had secured the ledger and, more importantly, secured a clean escape for himself and Elena Carver. They were now in a safe house, a quiet, remote property known only to Dominic, where Elena could finally rest and they could form their plan. While Elena slept, exhausted by a night of terror and confession, Dominic was on the phone with Jonas Vale back at the vault. The conversation was cold, direct, and filled with a tension thicker than blood. Dominic was hiding his knowledge of Jonas's betrayal for now, needing his right-hand man to maintain the illusion of loyalty while they dealt with the immediate threat. "The ledger is secured," Dominic informed Jonas, his voice a flat monotone. "Marco is injured but loose. We need to track his movements and, more importantly, we need to know why he's fixated on silencing Elena now after all these years." Jonas, sweating under the guise of concern, was trying to shift the blame to the police. "The pressure must have gotten to him, boss. He probably thought the widow was finally going to turn over that book. It's desperation." "It's more than desperation, Jonas," Dominic countered, looking at the sleeping child on a nearby sofa. Lila Carver, still wrapped in the blanket from the vault, stirred faintly. Marco knew exactly where Elena was hiding. He risked everything not just for a book but to eliminate the witness. It was then that Dominic saw it. A small, colorful drawing pinned haphazardly to the corkboard next to the sofa where Lila lay. It was a child's drawing of a room, messy but detailed. There was a large figure lying on the floor, surrounded by dark red crayon. And standing over the figure was another drawing, a man with spiky hair and an angry, dark circle drawn for a mouth. Dominic walked over and gently peeled the drawing off the board. It wasn't just a child's nightmare, it was a memory. The scene was too specific, too violent for simple imagination. He looked at the sleeping child. Lila was only 7 now, but she had been an infant, barely a year old, on the night her father, Dr. David Carver, was murdered. Infants don't remember. But toddlers, sometimes they internalize things in ways adults can't comprehend. When Elena woke up, Dominic sat her down, placing the unsettling drawing between them. "Elena," he said, his voice quiet but intense. Was she in the room that night? The night Marco killed your husband?" Elena looked at the drawing, her eyes widening in a slow, dawning horror. She reached for the paper, her hands trembling. "Oh God," she whispered, tracing the dark red crayon. I don't know. I found David in the living room. I remember hearing Lila's little cry from her crib. She was just in the next room, fussing. I grabbed her and ran. I never let her see. I never thought." Dominic leaned forward, his focus absolute. "Think, Elena. When Marco found your husband, was Lila awake? Was she silent?" Elena's eyes squeezed shut, straining to pull the forgotten details from her trauma. "I remember David had put a blanket over her crib to keep the morning light out. She was usually a heavy sleeper. But when I found David, she was awake. She wasn't crying hard, she was just watching the ceiling. She was silent. Eerily silent." The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. Lila hadn't just been in the apartment. She had been a small, silent witness to the murder, protected by the darkness of her blanket, but recording the terrifying sounds and shapes of the violence in her infant mind. Elena's breathing grew ragged. "She never talks about that night. Never. I thought she was too young to remember. She repressed it. That's what therapists call it, Dominic. A trauma so great the brain pushes it away." "But the drawing," Dominic pointed out, his finger tapping the image of the angry, spiky-haired man. "And the way she looked at Marco at the school. She didn't just recognize a scary man, she recognized the murderer." This was the shocking hidden truth that made everything clear. Marco didn't just want the ledger, he wanted to silence Lila. He hadn't just used her as a messenger. He had been testing her, showing his face to see if she reacted, confirming to himself that the child was the last living link to his most damning crime. Marco had seen the ledger as a corporate threat, but he saw Lila as a human threat. A small, innocent time bomb of repressed memory that could one day explode in a courtroom. "She's the only one," Elena said, her voice filled with despair. Marco got rid of everyone else. I was just the runner. Lila. She's the one who saw him. Dominic stood up, his face hardening into the familiar cold mask of command. The threat had escalated from a simple power struggle to the direct danger of a child's life. The stakes were no longer about money or territory. They were about protecting the last piece of innocence standing in the way of a monster. Marco doesn't know she remembers it consciously, Dominic stated, gathering his strength. He only suspects. But we can't take that risk. We have the ledger, Elena. But he wants the witness. We have to use the ledger as bait to draw him out, away from the only person who can truly identify him. He looked down at the child, who shifted slightly and then opened her big brown eyes. She looked up at Dominic, not with fear but with a trusting confusion. Mr. Dominic, Lila whispered, still half asleep. Is Mommy safe now? Is the mean man gone? Dominic looked at the child who had silently carried the trauma of her father's death for 7 years. He knelt beside her, his voice softening, filled with a sudden, fierce tenderness. You are both safe, Lila, Dominic promised. He gently tucked the blanket around her shoulders. The mean man is going away. Forever. Because you were brave enough to run to me. Lila smiled, a genuine, trusting little girl's smile, and closed her eyes again. Dominic stood, renewed by the fierce need to protect that fragile smile. He had a ledger and he had a silent witness. The time for hiding was over. It was time for a final confrontation where justice, in his own brutal, necessary way, would finally be served. The sun was now fully up, casting the city in a harsh, unforgiving light. The atmosphere in the vault was heavy, the air thick with unspoken secrets and rising panic. Jonas Vale was doing his best to maintain the appearance of calm, loyal efficiency, but inside he was a wreck. He knew Dominic Vergano was suspicious. Dominic's tone had been too cold, too controlled. Jonas paced his private office, his mind reeling from the discovery that Lila was a silent witness and that Marco's crime was the hideous organ trafficking ring. This wasn't the simple power struggle Marco had promised. This was a descent into pure evil, and Jonas was enabling it. He tried to call Marco to stop the madness, to tell him the heat from the ledger and the murder was too much, but Marco's line was dead. The silence was more terrifying than a direct threat. It meant Marco was still moving, still executing his plan, and still relying on Jonas's debt. A coded message from Marco finally hit Jonas's secure line. Need to confirm the identity of the old informant, the one who told the doctor. The witness is too risky. Get me the St. Jude's nurse database. Proof of loyalty. Now. The demand was chilling. Marco didn't just want to confirm his old spy. He wanted to eliminate anyone who might have ever suspected him. And he was demanding the entire hospital database of nurses, Elena's friends, her co-workers, all the innocent people who had nothing to do with this war. This was Marco's final, sick test of Jonas's loyalty. Jonas knew what he had to do. His loyalty to Dominic, to the organization, and to the small, sleeping Lila in the next room demanded he refuse. He had to tell Dominic everything. But then the fear the original poison Marco had used tightened its grip. He remembered the threats Marco had made years ago, the details Marco knew about Jonas's own quiet family, the fear in his wife's eyes. Marco was a monster, and monsters always keep their promises of violence. Chkaz sat down, head in his hands, truly torn between fear and loyalty. He knew this choice would forever condemn him. But the image of his own family, safe but vulnerable, outweighed the sudden, distant danger facing Elena's co-workers. He made the call. Not to Dominic, but to the IT specialist within their own organization who maintained backdoor access to various city networks, including the secure hospital systems. I need a dump of the St. Jude's hospital employee database, Jonas ordered, his voice hollow. Just the non-management staff, specifically the nursing roster. I need it transferred to this secure server. It's for a corporate security audit. The IT guy didn't question it. Within minutes, the file transfer was complete. Jonas felt a sick twist in his gut. He was betraying Dominic, and worse, he was unknowingly putting Elena's co-workers and friends in danger, handing Marco a massive list of potential loose ends to silence or use. He encrypted the file and sent it to Marco's secure address, adding only one word: done. The moment the file was sent, Jonas felt a profound, corrosive despair. He had crossed the line. There was no going back. He was now Marco's accomplice in a horrifying crime that reached far beyond the confines of their world. He stood up, walking toward the large window, staring out at the chaotic city. He had to redeem himself. He had to stop Marco. He had to reveal his truth to Dominic, no matter the cost. He pulled out his private burner phone, the one he used only for Marco. He smashed it, sending the small pieces scattering across the floor. He was cutting ties, severing the cord of his toxic debt. Jonas then called Dominic, his voice now ragged with genuine urgency, putting on the performance of a loyal man who had just made a terrible discovery. "Boss, I found something," Jonas said, trying to steady his voice. "Marco has a spy, an informant inside St. Jude's, maybe someone from the nurse's desk. He's digging for the person who spoke to David Carver. He's going to target the hospital's staff. It's too much chaos, boss. We need to focus on him now before he hits the hospital again." Dominic, already suspicious and now armed with the ledger and the knowledge of Lila's trauma, listened carefully. He knew Jonas was holding back, but the urgency about the hospital staff sounded genuine. "I know, Jonas," Dominic responded, his voice still measured and cold. "I'm one step ahead. I'm going to use the ledger to set the trap. Just keep Lila safe. That's all you have to worry about." Dominic's cold tone confirmed Jonas's worst fears. He hadn't confessed, but Dominic knew something was wrong. Jonas was now trapped between two terrifying men, having just handed a weapon to the monster he feared the most. Jonas stood alone in the dark room, the weight of his betrayal crashing down on him. He had chosen the safety of his own family, ensuring that the monster's attention remained on Elena and Dominic. He had saved himself, but in doing so he had doomed Elena's innocent colleagues, making him an undeniable part of Marco Silvani's murderous plot. The night was as dark and cold as the betrayal it held. At the safe house, a remote property nestled deep in the quiet Canadian countryside, Dominic Vergano was making his preparations. He had the ledger secured and Elena and Lila were safe, but he knew Marco Silvani was not finished. The frantic, hurried call from Jonas Vale about the hospital staff being targeted had been the final, necessary confirmation. Jonas was compromised and the hideout's location was likely known. Dominic had anticipated this. He hadn't built his life on trust. He had built it on caution, and he had learned long ago that the most dangerous enemy is the one you let get too close. He had prepared the safe house not just as a refuge, but as a sophisticated trap. The attack came just after midnight. It wasn't subtle. It was loud, desperate, and aggressive, exactly Marco's style. Dominic, already awake and positioned, watched from an upstairs window as 3 black SUVs roared up the long gravel driveway. Marco's men poured out, armed and moving with the blunt, brutal efficiency of thugs ordered to destroy everything in their path. Their target was the house, the evidence, and the witnesses. Dominic had moved Elena and Lila hours earlier to a highly secure, concrete bunker hidden beneath the property, activated by a silent, coded trigger. They were safe, unaware of the violence unfolding above them. The moment Marco's men reached the house, Dominic's countermeasures kicked in. The lights suddenly flared on, blinding the attackers. Then the silence was shattered by a massive, disorienting sound. A series of powerful, non-lethal flashbang charges that Dominic's security team had installed in the perimeter. The explosion of light and noise bought Dominic the critical seconds he needed. He didn't engage the main force. Instead, he slipped out a rear entrance, moving like a dark phantom toward the road where he knew the command car would be waiting. The car he knew Marco would have designated for his loyal right-hand man. Just a mile down the dark, empty road, the command car sat idling. Jonas Vale was inside, ostensibly guarding the escape route, but truly waiting to ensure Marco's men executed their mission to silence Elena and retrieve the ledger. Jonas was jumpy, repeatedly checking his phone for Marco's final confirmation. He didn't see the shadow approaching his car until the passenger door was yanked open with a violent wrench and a cold, hard piece of metal. A gun was pressed against his temple. "Don't move, Jonas." Dominic Vergano's voice was a low, terrifying growl. It was not the voice of an angry boss. It was the voice of cold, absolute rage. Jonas froze, his blood turning to ice. He looked up at Dominic, whose eyes were twin points of lethal fire. The mask of calm had cracked, revealing the raw fury underneath. "Boss, I was just guarding the exit," Jonas stammered, the fear paralyzing his tongue. "I swear I didn't know they were coming." "You knew, Jonas." Dominic said flatly, pulling him roughly out of the car. You knew because you told them where to find us. You were Marco's eyes for 7 years. The hospital database, the doctor's death. It was you, wasn't it? Dominic shoved Jonas against the car with bone-jarring force. The sudden physical assault, combined with the crushing realization that his betrayal had been exposed, shattered Jonas's last sliver of control. Yes. Yes, it was me. Jonas cried out, the years of hidden guilt and fear pouring out in a torrent. He threatened my family, Dominic. He knew where my wife and kids were. Marco said he'd kill them if I didn't keep Elena quiet and keep you out of his business. I owed him a debt of silence, boss. I couldn't risk my family. He confessed everything. The debt to Marco, the failure to protect Elena 7 years ago, the lie about the cold case cleanup, and finally the ultimate betrayal, handing over the hospital roster to Marco hours earlier. The confession, raw and desperate, didn't lessen Dominic's fury. It intensified it. It wasn't just about a stolen ledger or a rival boss. It was about the sickening realization that his most trusted man had actively worked with a monster who dealt in human lives, all while letting an innocent woman carry the burden of his silence. Dominic stepped back, the gun still aimed, but his hands visibly shaking, not with fear, but with the immense, agonizing effort to restrain his impulse to deliver immediate justice. You gave him the names of innocent nurses, Dominic stated, the sound barely a whisper, yet colder than any yell. People who trusted Elena. You handed them over to a man who harvests human organs. For your own family's comfort, you condemned others to terror. Jonas slumped, defeated. I know it was wrong. But I can help, boss. I told you he was coming. I can tell you where he's going next. He's going to use the hospital list to draw you out of the city. He thinks you'll panic and run. Dominic slowly holstered his weapon. He had the confession and he had the necessary information. The fury remained, but his focus had to shift back to the mission. My fight isn't with you right now, Jonas, Dominic stated, his voice now regaining its chilling control. My fight is with the animal who forced you into this. But you will pay your debt to me first. He snapped his fingers and 2 of his loyal, trusted bodyguards, who had been silently securing the perimeter, emerged from the darkness. Take him, Dominic ordered, gesturing toward Jonas. To the underground holding cell. He is not to speak to anyone. He is not to move. He will wait there until this is over. Jonas didn't resist. He went quietly, the relief of having the terrible secret finally out mixing strangely with the fear of his inevitable future. Dominic watched them go, the sound of Marco's men still firing uselessly at the heavily fortified safe house. His face was a mask of cold resolution. The betrayal was confirmed. The motives were clear. The enemy was exposed. Dominic returned to the safe house, the sound of the futile gunfire barely registering. He had everything he needed. The ledger, the location, the motive, and the identity of the informant. Now he would turn Marco's plan on its head and use the chaos to deliver the justice that Elena and Lila deserved. Dominic found Elena at the bunker entrance, tears of fear and relief staining her cheeks. He looked at her, then at the innocent child sleeping beside her. The betrayal had fueled his rage, transforming him from a calculated protector into an unstoppable force, ready to end the nightmare once and for all. The moment Dominic Vargano secured the safe house and confirmed Jonas's betrayal, he knew Marco's next move wouldn't be for the ledger. It would be for the true witness. Marco had confirmed his plan was to use the hospital roster to pull Dominic out of the city, creating a diversion. But Dominic had the upper hand. He knew Marco was targeting Elena, not the hospital. Marco needed to flush out Elena, and he had only one way left to do it. Back at the vault, the heavily guarded but now compromised fortress, Lila Carver was still asleep under the watchful but terrified eye of the security detail. The moment Dominic had left Jonas in the custody of loyal men, he had called the vault, intending to move Lila to an even more secure, undisclosed location. But he was too late. Marco, knowing that his attack on the hideout would fail and likely expose Jonas, had already executed his final desperate move. Using the chaos of the night and a small, forgotten maintenance access tunnel known only to those deep inside the operation, information likely supplied years ago by Jonas, Marco Silvani and a small, ruthless crew had bypassed the vault's primary security. They hadn't touched the money or the files. They went straight for the target. When Dominic's call came, a frantic security guard could only report the shattering news. The rear entrance was breached, the watch was neutralized, and Lila was gone. Marco had the witness. He immediately sent a coded message to Dominic's secure line, gloating. "You wanted the ledger, Dominic? I took the bird. Trade the ledger for the girl. Tonight. The old shipping yard. Come alone. Or the bird sings for me." The raw, primal fear that hit Dominic was unlike anything he had ever felt. His fury over the betrayal and the murder plot was now focused into a single terrifying drive: saving the child. He didn't hesitate. He told Elena the truth, his voice tight with controlled resolve. Elena, though shattered by the news, held Dominic's gaze with fierce, maternal strength. "Go," Elena commanded, tears streaming down her face. "Bring her back. I don't care about the book. I only care about Lila." The old, abandoned shipping yard by the docks was a fitting place for the final confrontation. A maze of rusted metal containers, looming cranes, and deep, cold shadows. It was a place where things were shipped away, forgotten, and sometimes buried. Dominic arrived alone, the ledger tucked into his coat, his movements silent and lethal. The air smelled of brine, rust, and oil. He found Marco standing near a massive stack of containers, flanked by 2 armed men. Lila was huddled next to Marco, held tightly by a large man, her face tear-streaked and pale, but her eyes fixed on Dominic with a desperate plea. "Hello, Dominic." Marco greeted him, his face bruised and swollen from the earlier fight, but his eyes burning with triumphant malice. "We're 2 old friends making a simple exchange. Hand over the book and you get the bird." Dominic stopped a safe distance away. "Let her go first, Marco. He's terrified. You don't need her. You need the book." "Oh, but I do need her," Marco sneered, walking toward Dominic. "You see, this little bird is the only living thing that can testify against me. The book is evidence, but she is the witness. She saw me kill her father. And that is why she has to disappear." Marco's men tightened their grip on Lila, who let out a small, terrified sob. Dominic's control snapped. "You prey on the innocent and sell human parts, Marco. You're not a rival, you're a monster." Marco laughed, a grating sound. He walked up to Dominic, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, revealing the full scale of his ambition and the depth of the betrayal. "The organs, the debt, the doctor, that was just the beginning, Dominic. That ledger isn't just about me. It's about a global network. It exposes every dirty politician, every corrupt hospital CEO, and every black market operator who funds this ring. That book could destroy half the criminal empires in 5 countries. That's why I need to destroy it, and that's why Elena has been running." Marco revealed that the ledger wasn't just a threat to his small organization. It was a devastating threat to an entire, massive network that was relying on him to clean up the mess. "And now you have a choice, Dominic," Marco concluded, stepping back and gesturing toward Lila. "Give me the book and the network will thank you. I walk away and you become the new king. Or keep the book and the girl dies and I expose your own network to the police via my friend Jonas." Dominic reached into his coat and slowly pulled out the leather-bound ledger. Marco's eyes gleamed with greed and relief. But Dominic didn't throw it. He tossed it high into the air over Marco's head, where it landed on top of a massive dark blue shipping container. "If that book destroys your network, then you're not getting it," Dominic roared. "And you're not getting the girl." The distraction was minimal, but it was enough. Marco's eyes tracked the book. Dominic lunged not for Marco but for Lila. He moved with a devastating speed that was almost inhuman. He neutralized the first guard with a single brutal strike to the head. The second guard, holding Lila, instinctively raised his gun. But before he could fire, Dominic was on him. He shielded Lila, pulling her small body away as he engaged the man. Marco recovered instantly, screaming in rage. He pulled his own weapon, firing wildly at Dominic. The shipping yard became a hellscape of echoing gunfire and brutal close-quarters combat. Dominic fought with the ferocity of a wild animal protecting its young. He delivered crushing blows, using the maze of containers as cover and weaponry. He was fighting not for territory or power, but for the life of the frightened child clinging to his coat. He finally knocked the second guard unconscious and shoved Lila behind a large metal crate, shielding her with his body. "Stay down, Lila. Don't move." Dominic turned back to face Marco, who had dropped his gun in frustration and was now advancing with a long, glinting knife in his hand. The final confrontation was ugly, visceral, and personal. The two men circled each other, their history, their hatred, and the weight of their two innocent victims, Dr. Carver and the now terrified Lila, fueling their every move. Marco was screaming about power, money, and the global network. Dominic was silent, his face a mask of deadly purpose. Dominic finally cornered Marco near the edge of the docks, the black water churning below them. Marco swung the knife wildly, fueled by desperation. Dominic moved with controlled precision, blocking the thrusts until he saw his opportunity. He lunged not to injure but to disarm. He grabbed Marco's wrist, twisting and slamming him backward over the edge of the dock, the sounds of the struggle muffled by a sickening splash. Dominic didn't look down. He walked quickly back to the crate. He knelt down beside the shaking, whimpering Lila. He pulled her into his massive arms, holding her tightly against his chest, shielding her from the horrific noise and the smell of gunpowder and fear. "It's over, Lila," Dominic whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief. "He's gone. You're safe now. I promise." He held her there, the powerful, feared Mafia boss comforting the terrified, fragile girl in the lonely, abandoned shipping yard. The war was over, the monster silenced, and in the deep shadows, love and protection had finally won. The cold, dark silence of the shipping yard was finally broken by the approaching sirens. Dominic Vergano remained crouched, shielding Lila until the moment he heard the familiar sounds of his loyal men arriving. Not the police but the specialized security team he had summoned the second he knew Lila was safe. Dominic carefully carried the exhausted but safe Lila Carver away from the docks and into a waiting vehicle, placing her gently into Elena's arms. The reunion was silent, powerful, and utterly heartbreaking. Elena hugged her daughter with a fierce, shaking relief, kissing her forehead over and over. Dominic didn't linger. He knew the police would arrive soon, led by Detective Rowan Hale, and he needed to control the narrative. He directed his men to secure the area, ensuring that every trace of his personal involvement was meticulously wiped clean. He then made the most important call of the night, not to his lawyers but to a high-level government contact, a person who understood the sensitive, terrifying nature of Marco Silvani's organ trafficking ledger. The ledger was not going to a beat cop. It was too explosive for that. It implicated judges, politicians, and high-ranking hospital officials. Dominic knew that if the local police got their hands on it, it would be buried and the corruption would continue. Dominic met the contact at a neutral location and handed over the ledger and his own detailed, anonymous report on Marco Silvani's network. He provided evidence that directly linked Marco to the Dr. David Carver murder 7 years prior, and explained how the subsequent attempt to silence the widow and the child witness had led to the final confrontation. Within hours, the news broke in the city. Marco Silvani was confirmed dead, his operations crumbling, and a massive, terrifying investigation into a global organ trafficking ring was underway. Dominic Vergano had successfully engineered the outcome: justice for David Carver and safety for his family. With the immediate threat eliminated and the official investigation underway, Dominic knew he couldn't simply leave Elena and Lila in their cramped, exposed apartment. Elena had faced a trauma no one should endure, and Lila was a fragile witness who needed long-term safety and stability. Dominic moved them into a sprawling, quiet property he owned just outside the city. A place with high walls, professional, discreet security, and the kind of anonymity that was impossible to find downtown. Elena, despite the fear, felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace for the first time in 7 years. She sat with Dominic in the huge, bright kitchen, watching Lila play with a new set of art supplies. "I don't know how to thank you, Dominic," Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You risked everything, your entire life, for us." Dominic looked at her, his usual stoicism softened by the quiet victory. "You and Lila saved me too, Elena," he admitted, the rare confession surprising even himself. "You forced me to face a part of my world I thought I had buried. And you taught me that some things are worth more than power or money." He made her a solemn promise: "You and Lila will be protected here for as long as you need. No one will ever touch you again." Elena reached across the table and touched his hand, a gesture of pure, grateful trust that meant more than any spoken word. While Dominic was creating a new, safe world for Elena and Lila, Detective Rowan Hale was standing in the ruins of the shipping yard, watching the cleanup. He knew the official story, that Marco was killed by his own crew during an internal dispute that went sideways. But Rowan wasn't buying it. He knew Dominic Vergano was involved. Rowan had successfully closed the cold case of Dr. David Carver. The ledger evidence was devastating. But he couldn't shake the fact that every event, the cry of the child, the appearance of the widow, the demise of Marco Silvani, all pointed to Dominic's deliberate, calculated intervention. Rowan filed the closure report on the Carver murder, but he kept a separate file marked only, the vault and the nurse. He knew Dominic Vergano had protected the witness and delivered the evidence. But Rowan also knew that a man like Dominic Vergano did not simply walk away from that kind of power or that kind of commitment. He suspected that Dominic's sudden, fierce protection of Elena and Lila was about to become a permanent arrangement. The detective looked at the headline on his phone. Marco Silvani dead. Major corruption ring exposed. He had justice for the doctor, but he had a new mystery. The forbidden connection between the most feared boss in the city and the innocent nurse he saved. Rowan leaned back in his car, starting a new line of inquiry. He would prove that Dominic Vergano, in his attempt to save the innocent, had only deepened his own involvement in a world of corruption. He knew this was not an ending. It was simply the beginning of the next chapter. Elena and Lila, safe in their new home, were finally smiling, surrounded by light and quiet peace. But miles away, a determined detective was already plotting his next move, ensuring that the saga of Dominic Vergano and the Carvers was far from over, leaving the audience with the heartwarming victory of love, and the thrilling promise of a relentless chase to come. We have come to the end of the story. Thank you for watching to the end. Share your opinion about this story in the comments below. I like getting feedback from my audience. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our heartwarming stories.